The night she laughed at me in front of everyone was the night I stopped pretending to be small. I had known Claire since college, back when we shared instant noodles and impossible dreams, but somewhere between her engagement ring and her new circle of polished friends, I became an embarrassment she tolerated instead of a friend she valued. Her engagement dinner was held at her parents' estate, all crystal lights and soft violin music, and I almost didn't go. But she had insisted. "It wouldn't be complete without you," she'd said. I should have heard the tone behind the words. The moment I arrived, I felt the shift. The women wore designer gowns, I wore a simple navy dress. The men talked about investments and expansions, I listened quietly, observing. I've always preferred observing. Claire introduced me to her fiancé with a careless smile. "This is Emma. She's just admin at some company." Just admin. The words were light, but they landed heavy. A few guests gave polite nods, the kind reserved for background characters. I smiled because that's what I do when I'm calculating. What none of them knew was that I had chosen that position. Titles can be loud distractions. Access is silent power. I didn't correct her. Not yet. I wanted to see how far she would go, how much of me she was willing to shrink to make herself feel taller. Dinner was served under golden chandeliers, and I watched the dynamics unfold like a chessboard. Claire's parents hovered around her fiancé, Daniel, as if he were already royalty. They asked about his company, his future plans, the merger he was negotiating. I kept my eyes lowered, but my ears open. The name of the company made my pulse steady, not quicken. I knew it well. Very well. Daniel eventually turned to me, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps curiosity. "So, Emma," he said, swirling his wine glass, "what exactly do you do?" Claire laughed before I could answer. "Oh, she handles paperwork and schedules. You know, the invisible glue." Invisible. That word again. I met Daniel's gaze for the first time that evening, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Uncertainty? I couldn't tell. I simply said, "I manage operations." It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Claire rolled her eyes playfully, but her father's hand tightened slightly around his fork. He knew that phrase carried weight in certain rooms. I felt the air change, subtle but undeniable. Whispers drifted from the other end of the table when I mentioned a recent restructuring strategy that had saved a client millions. I never named the client. I didn't need to. Claire's smile began to strain at the edges. She thought she knew my story because she had known my past. But she had never bothered to ask about my present. And tonight, for the first time, I wondered if she was about to realize just how much she had underestimated me. The moment Daniel asked me which division I managed, I knew the game had shifted. His tone wasn't mocking like Claire's, it was careful. Curious. I placed my glass down gently and answered, "Global restructuring and acquisitions oversight." I watched the words settle over the table. Claire blinked. "That sounds big for admin," she said with a tight laugh. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Daniel. "It is," I replied calmly. He leaned back in his chair, studying me in a way that made the room feel smaller. "Oversight for which company?" he asked. There it was, the question that mattered. I had hoped it wouldn't come like this, in front of chandeliers and staged smiles, but Claire had pushed. I gave him the name of the parent group that owned his company. Silence followed. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just heavy. Claire's father's fork hit his plate softly. Her mother's expression drained of warmth. Daniel didn't look shocked. He looked unsettled. "That's our majority stakeholder," he said slowly. I nodded once. "Yes. It is." Claire let out a small scoff, like she thought I was exaggerating, but uncertainty crept into her eyes. I didn't elaborate. I didn't boast. I simply allowed the truth to breathe in the room. The same room where I had just been called invisible. I saw Daniel's posture change, the subtle straightening, the mental recalculating. He wasn't asking who I was anymore. He was remembering meetings. Emails. A name signed on executive directives. My name. And in that moment, I realized Claire had never once asked what I actually did because she never expected the answer to matter. Claire finally broke the silence. "You're joking, right?" she said, but her voice lacked confidence. I turned to her slowly. "Do I look like I'm joking?" I asked, not cruelly, just plainly. Daniel spoke before she could respond. "Emma Hart," he said carefully. Hearing my full name from his mouth shifted everything. I met his gaze and nodded. Recognition settled fully across his face now. Respect followed. "You chaired the emergency board call last quarter," he added. It wasn't a question. Claire's parents exchanged a look that carried more panic than pride. They understood what this meant for their future son-in-law's company. I had signed off on the funding extension that had kept it afloat during a difficult transition. I had approved the compliance audit that Daniel had struggled through. I had chosen to remain quiet about my involvement because I never believed friendship required hierarchy. Claire stared at me like I had transformed into someone else, but I hadn't changed. She had simply never looked closely. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. I held her gaze steadily. "You never asked." The words weren't sharp, they were honest. The room no longer saw me as background decoration. They saw leverage. Influence. Authority. But none of that felt satisfying. What hurt wasn't the laughter or the label of just admin. It was the realization that someone who once knew my dreams had reduced me to something small for convenience. Daniel stood and extended his hand toward me, a formal gesture now. "It's an honor," he said quietly. Claire's smile was gone completely. And as the weight of truth settled over the table, I understood something clearly. I didn't need to prove who I was. I only needed to stop allowing others to define it.